This morning I'd like to notice with you a lesson that is recorded for us in the 11th chapter of the book of Numbers. After being out in Las Vegas this week, that city is built right in the middle of a desert. And as we were flying in, it was obvious that the city is surrounded by a desert, and it's in a desert. And it kind of brought to my mind the journey of the nation of Israel during their time in the desert. You might remember that after they were delivered from Egypt through the blood of the Passover lamb, they crossed the Red Sea into the wilderness. It would have been an 11-day journey for them to have gone from the Red Sea to the River Jordan had they followed the Lord's leadership. Unfortunately, they did not. And so this people, this redeemed, blood-bought people, ended up staying in the desert for 40 years. And, of course, the journeys of Israel in the wilderness have many lessons for God's children. It would be incredible. I've never done this homework. If some of you are interested, I would appreciate it. How many times this deliverance from Egypt and their time in the wilderness is referenced in the Bible? Many times, in the Old and in the New Testaments. And of course, it's written for our learning. I want to notice with you a statement that the Apostle Paul made in Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. So the experience of Israel in the wilderness is written and preserved for us for our learning. And what are we to learn? That we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. So the Old Testament is very dear and meaningful to us in the New Testament church. But this morning, we certainly have doctrinal lessons taught us in the Exodus, in the deliverance of Israel from Egypt. They were the chosen people. And when Moses was instructed to slay the Passover lamb, not one drop of that blood was shed for anybody but the Israelites. And every person that blood was shed for got out of Egypt. Not one was left behind. Moses was a great success as an emancipator, as a deliverer. He did not miss one. He didn't leave one behind that he came to deliver. And I believe Moses in that way is a beautiful picture of Jesus Christ, our Savior. Jesus will not lose one he came to save. Every one of them will be with him in glory someday. But once they cross the Red Sea and get into the wilderness, now it is a time for them to grow in their faith, to grow in their walk with God. And sadly, we see this redeemed, blood-bought people who have been brought out of horrible bondage in Egypt and on their way to the promised land, flowing with milk and honey, we begin to see them murmur and complain about God and God's treating of them and God's provisions. So let's begin maybe in verse 4 of Numbers 11. And the mixed multitude that was among them fell a lusting, and the children of Israel also wept again and said, Who shall give us flesh to eat? We remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers, the melons, and the leeks, and the onions, and the garlic. But now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all beside this manna before our eyes. So here they are, a redeemed people, And I can tell you, they saw a lot of miracles, didn't they? They saw the 10 plagues fall on Egypt. They saw the sun darken, the Nile River turn to blood, the land filled with lice and boils, the firstborn of every Egyptian family dying. They saw many miracles, not to mention the miracle of dividing the Red Sea, where they went through kicking up dust. Now that was a miracle. You know, a lot of people today think, if I could just have my miracle, I believe I would really serve God and I would really be committed to Him. Folks, what you and I really need in our lives are not more miracles. What we need is what we already have, and that's Jesus Christ. Would anybody agree with that today? A lot of people want signs and miracles. Well, look at Israel. They had them. And yet they're out there murmuring and complaining in the desert, saying, we remember how good we had it in Egypt as slaves. Because we had melons and garlic and leeks and onions and fish. We had flesh to eat. And now all we've got to eat out here in the desert is this manna. The Bible calls it angel food. It must have been pretty good, but they're getting tired of it. And so they're murmuring and they are complaining in the desert. Now, let's drop down to verse 10, where we began to read about Moses. Then Moses heard the people weep throughout their families, every man in the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly. Moses also was displeased. And Moses said unto the Lord. Now here is Moses' prayer to God. I want you to pay close attention as Moses begins to pray to God. He's got millions of people in the desert, and they're murmuring, they're complaining. Many of them are wanting to go back to Egypt. They don't understand. They're not traveling by faith. They're just like little murmuring, spoiled brats. And Moses is having to deal with them, and there's millions of them. I tell you, our hearts ought to sympathize with Moses. I can tell you that man had a big job on his hands. And so, listen to Moses now. And Moses said unto the Lord, wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant? Talking about himself. And wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all this people upon me? Now Moses is complaining. Have I conceived all this people? Have I begotten them? Don't y'all like the way the King James Bible is written? It's in G rating. You read some of the newer translations and you wouldn't want to read that in front of your kids. Don't we love the King James Bible? But you get the point. Moses is saying, did I conceive all of these people? Have I begotten them that thou shouldest say unto me, carry them in thy bosom, as a nursing father beareth the suckling child, unto the land which thou swarest unto their fathers? When should I have flesh to give unto all this people? For they weep unto me, saying, give us flesh, that we may eat. And Moses says to God, I am not able to bear all this people alone, because it is too heavy for me. And if thou deal thus with me, kill me. Now that's what Moses says. If you're going to deal with me like this, God, just kill me. I pray thee, out of hand, if I have found favor in thy sight, and let me not see my wretchedness. Now, is Moses complaining? Yes. But Moses is not dealt the severe punishment that the children of Israel are punished. Why? Well, I'll tell you what I believe. the children of Israel are murmuring and complaining to each other and to Moses about God. Moses is going directly to God and praying and talking to God. There's a big difference there, beloved. Let's say somebody is upset with their boss and they're going around talking to everybody in the office or in the factory about the boss. They're just constantly complaining about the boss. That's one thing, and that's not a good thing. But if that person goes to the boss and begins to lay out their problems, then that's fair enough. Would you all say that's fair enough? That's what's going on here. Instead of Israel talking to God and praying to God, they're murmuring and complaining among themselves. And so God deals harshly with them because of their murmuring and their complaining. But God, look what God does for Moses. When Moses, in prayer to God, begins to complain, look what God does. Let's notice, beginning in verse 16, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Gather unto us 70 men, or gather unto me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom thou knowest to be the elders of the people, and officers among them, and bring them unto the tabernacle of the congregation, that they may stand there with thee. And I will come down and talk with thee there, and I will take of the Spirit which is upon thee, and will put it upon them. And they shall bear the burden of the people with thee, that thou bear it not thyself alone." What God does when Moses prays to God about his problems, God in mercy helps Moses by giving him 70 men to help him carry the burden. Isn't that a good God? Now, this morning, the lesson that I want us to get out of this, and as I say, there are many lessons contained in the experience of Israel as they leave Egypt and go into the promised land. But this morning, I want to talk a little while about our wilderness journey. I've been around so many people in the last few weeks who have really been going through what I would call a wilderness journey. A lot of heartaches. When Nelda and I were over in Statesboro, Georgia recently for the anniversary of that church, the first brother we saw on the church ground that day was a brother from Athens, Georgia. When I was there pastoring many years ago, he and his wife and the kids joined the church there back in 1983. He had a beautiful wife, a school teacher, very bright, very talented, very faithful, very hospitable in her home. Then he got a job in Athens at the University of Georgia teaching up there, so they moved up to Athens. And I began to hear that his wife was beginning to lose her mind. At the age of 42, Mona was going into the dark, dark world of Alzheimer's. She's 62 years old now. Brother Tony called me a while back, and he thought she was near death. And he said, "Brother Sam, no pastor I know knows her when she was well but you, and I would like for you to help with the funeral service." That's trouble, folks. That's 20 years. Ronald Reagan's wife said when he was suffering from Alzheimer's, she said, "It's a long goodbye." Others have described it as death in slow motion. That's a wilderness journey. That's a dark wilderness journey. But I want to say on behalf of this dear man, and Nelda can testify to it, he is one of the brightest, he's one of the most cheerful men to be around. Now I know, any thinking person knows Brother Tony has had his moments. He definitely has had those lonely moments in life. But instead of him murmuring and complaining, everybody that knows him, including his 4 children, say that he's just their rock. He has borne up under that. I thank God for people like Brother Tony who have such a great witness in life. Recently, I went out to a man's home here in Birmingham. He was selling something on Craigslist that we were interested in, and I drove out to his home, and he lived in a beautiful neighborhood, and the houses in that area run around $400,000. But he was telling me, he said, we're trying to downsize. We can't sell our house. We need to sell it. He said, in 2008, I lost so much money during that economic crash. And he said, we'll never be able to retire. And he said, so many of our friends are in that same condition. We'll have to work as long as we physically can. And they're just trying to get rid of everything they possibly can. Now, that's a wilderness, folks. You know, when you've saved up and you've planned for retirement and it's all taken away in an economic downturn, that's a wilderness in this life. I have a dear friend in Georgia, Sister Wanda Grubbs, who recently lost her 40-year-old son, and the same day her only sibling died, her brother. And 2 weeks ago her mother died, and her husband, Brother Grubbs, is critically ill with cancer, and they don't think he'll live a lot longer. Now that's trouble. You know, you wonder, and when I talked to Sister Wanda on the phone, she said all the right things. Now, was she sincere? I believe she was. She's a child of God, and she loves the Lord, and she's humble, and she trusts in God. But that's trouble, folks, to have gone through all of that in such a short period of time. People who lose their loved ones in death. Or maybe you've been married to somebody you loved and they're unfaithful to you and they leave you and abandon you. That's trouble. All kinds of wilderness experiences that people go through in this life. Junior high can be one. Does anybody remember junior high? I heard somebody the other day say that's rough terrain. That's a rough landscape, you know. You're not a kid, but you're not adult. And people can be pretty mean in there. And I tell you, that can be a wilderness for people. I mean, you know, there's just all kinds of wildernesses that I could talk about this morning. But, you know, the empty nest can be I heard a guy say the other day, he said their last kid got their driver's license, and he said, you know, that's the next thing to an empty nest. Once they get their driver's license, they're gone. And he said, I came in one day and I said, where is everybody? And my wife said, we are everybody. And that's kind of an empty nest, you know. You just, life is hard on this earth. And I believe anybody who is thinking that way out there's going to be a utopia for me on this earth, you are mistaken, you are disillusioned. But when we're going through those seasons, and of course Israel was in the wilderness for 40 years, a lot of that was a judgment on them because of their complaining and their murmuring and they're not trusting in God. But you might go through, in your life, you might go through a number of wildernesses. You might get through one and enjoy a happy season, and then you might be going through another difficulty in life. But beloved, the lesson that I get out of Numbers chapter 11 is that instead of us murmuring about our problems, instead of us complaining and just going around to everybody, complaining, murmuring, there's an old expression we used to hear in Georgia, belly aching. Do any of y'all know what that means? just belly aching all the time. Instead of us doing that, and you may have a lot of problems, I understand that, but instead of us doing that to our family, our friends, our church family, our, people that we go to school with or work, instead of doing that, why don't we just go quietly into our closet of prayer and begin to pour out your complaints to God, because He can take it. And the Bible gives us many examples of what I would call heavyweight disciples of God who complain to God. I want to turn with you just a moment to Psalm 13. David. Would y'all consider David a great man of God? I would. But listen to David in Psalm 13 and verse 1. How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord? Forever? Did y'all hear that? This is David talking to God and saying to God, you have forgotten me. And how long are you going to forget me? Forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long shall mine enemy be exalted over me? Consider and hear me, O Lord my God, lighten mine. I can give you a number of examples of what we might call lamenting on the parts of God's children as they are taking their heartaches, their burdens, and their trials to God. That's what Moses is doing in the wilderness. He's going to God, and he's saying, I didn't birth all these people. I didn't help conceive them. I didn't even volunteer for this job. You called me. You remember where Moses was? He was a shepherd out in, I guess Moses was enjoying his life as a shepherd taking care of sheep. And God appears to him in a burning bush. And God calls him. He didn't volunteer. And I guess Moses is thinking, God, I didn't volunteer for this job. You called me to do it. And now I got millions of people. See, I say millions. Bible students think there's anywhere from 2 to 4 million of these freed slaves out in the desert, and they're all murmuring to Moses, wanting flesh to eat. Now, I'll have to say this. When I read about them eating the same food every day, I can kind of halfway sympathize with them. Nell and I eat oatmeal about once or twice a week. I can eat it once or twice a week. What if you had to eat oatmeal 3 times a day for the next month? You reckon any of us would be complaining? Ooh. When we got to Las Vegas, they took us to the most fabulous buffet I've ever seen in my life. It had 6 food stations. Italian, Greek, Mexican, Chinese. We are blessed in this country, aren't we, to have an abundance of food. And sometimes we can't even think of what we want to eat because we've just been blessed so much. What if you had to eat the same food every day for a long time, even if it is angels' food, and live in tents out in the desert? Yes, these people really, they are going through a trial. That's obvious. But life is always going to be that way for everybody on this earth. And so if they would have just gone to the Lord, and if they would have prayed to God and made their complaints to God, I believe they would have been a lot better off out there in the wilderness. But you know what God said to Moses? He said, okay, I'm going to feed them flesh. I'm going to bring quail in, and I'm going to give them all the quail they can eat. Do y'all remember that story? The quail came in by the millions. And God said, I'm not going to give them quail for a day. I'm going to give them quail for a month. They're going to eat so much flesh until it'll be running out of their nostrils. And they get sick of it and loathsome. Beloved, it's really not a good thing for us in this life to complain. It's a good thing for us to give thanks to the Lord for all of His manifold blessings on us in this life. And when you're in a season in your life, and I can tell you that all of these things are seasons. They don't come to stay forever. They come to pass. Problems in life don't last forever. But when you're in one of these seasons, may I encourage all of us today to let our faith grow during that season. You see, in the wilderness, your faith has an incredible opportunity to grow, or it has an incredible opportunity to die. And when our problems and our trials are upon us, let us begin to trust in the Almighty. That's exactly what Joshua and Caleb did. These 2 spies, 12 spies were sent out to spy out the land. You remember that? 12 spies. 10 of the spies come back and say, it's a good land. There's no question about it. It's a land flowing with milk and honey, but we can't take the land because there are giants over there, and their cities are walled up to heaven. But Joshua and Caleb remember the mighty hand of God that brought them up out of Egypt as on eagle's wings. And they're remembering the mighty power of God. And you know what they said? They said, let us go up at once and take the land. Their faith was a model for our faith today. You see, the 10 spies, you can't go by the majority count all the time, can you? Don't take a nose count to see which way you ought to go. No, sir. These 2 men were in the minority, but they said, let us go up at once. But the majority ruled, and so they turned back into the wilderness. And for 40 years they wandered in that wilderness, eating the same food and drinking water from a dry rock, when they could have crossed the Jordan River, and they could have been living in houses they didn't build. They could have been drinking from wells they didn't dig. They could have been eating from vineyards that they didn't plant. They could have been enjoying the good life by faith. And I'll tell you what I believe today. I believe the vast majority of the redeemed people of God are still in the wilderness of disobedience and a lack of faith. And their lives are hollow, and they may have a lot of this world's goods, but there's an emptiness deep down inside, a lack of contentment and satisfaction, and they're in a wilderness. When you could, by faith in God, cross over and become a true disciple of Jesus Christ and follow Him. And did you know Joshua and Caleb were the only 2 of these slaves out of the millions above the age of 20. They were the only 2 that lived to go into the land of promise. And when they were 85 years old, you know what Caleb said? 85 years old. He said, my strength today is as great as it was when I was 45 years old. God preserved his strength. And he said to Moses, he said, give me this mountain. And you know what mountain it was? It was the mountain where the giants lived. This man had faith. He wasn't scared of the giants. He wasn't scared of their weapons, because his faith was in a God who has all power in heaven and on this earth. And when you face life's problems today, beloved, may I encourage you as a pastor, as a minister, as a brother in Christ, exercise your faith. Don't look at your problem. Don't focus on your problem, but focus on God. You know, when David went out to face the giant Goliath, he wasn't looking at that giant. He wasn't asking how tall he was, how big the sword was. He wasn't asking any of that. You know the question that this man asked? David? David said this, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he would defy the armies of the living God? God's bigger than any problem you and I have got today. And if we get our eyes off the problem and begin to look to God, He'll give us grace, He'll give us strength, He'll help us through any trial. Now, you can choose to do that, or you can just choose to murmur and complain, and I can promise you that'll get you nowhere. I know, because I've tried it. It's foolish to murmur and complain. Instead of murmuring about your situation and complaining about it, may we put our faith in the living God and trust Him. Some people say, well, problems in life make us. Well, they can make us, or they can destroy us, depending on our attitude. You know, when a great problem confronts us in this life, we just need to have the attitude of faith and trusting in God and leaning on the everlasting arms and looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. And we know that His grace is sufficient for us in this life. But if we don't have that attitude, if we get bitter, and how many of us today know people who are bitter? Very bitter, because of life's disappointments. Maybe they were jilted. Maybe they were dating somebody and maybe engaged to get married and they were jilted. or maybe you've been in a marriage and your loved one, your spouse cheated on you and left you. People can end up very bitter. I know people today who are very bitter because they lost their business. They started a business. And the business failed, and they're really struggling today just to make ends meet, and they get bitter. Bitterness is poison to the soul. It is poison. And the Bible talks about the root of bitterness can spring up. And what does the root of bitterness do when it springs up? See, when it's a root, you can't see it. A root is hidden. But the problem with the root is it doesn't stay a root. It springs up. And then what does it do? Paul said it defiles many. I know a church one time, years and years ago in Georgia, who had one bitter person in that church, and that was a very influential member of that church. But that person got so bitter because they didn't get their way about something, and that bitterness began to defile the whole congregation. Do you want to live your life bitter? Do you want to go through life feeling sorry for yourself, beaten down? Right here in Alabama, we have one of the greatest examples to me in the history of the United States of America, Helen Keller. She was born blind, or when she was an infant, she had this fever that left her blind and deaf. She lived her whole life blind and deaf. This wonderful teacher came to their home. Her name was Ann Sullivan, and began to teach her. And in a world of total darkness and total silence, Helen began to learn. She taught her language by the sense of touch. The first letter she ever spelled in her hand was the word water. You can go up today to Helen's home, and there that old water pump is. It's a wonderful experience. Take your kids up there sometime and let them look at a woman who really had some problems. And Helen became one of the greatest women in American history today. Incredible story. You say, Pastor, I don't want to hear about Helen Keller. And I don't want any problems. I want my life to be easy, smooth. Well, you're going to have to wait till you get to heaven for that. Because down here, it's hard, folks. As I've told you all many times, it's hard. We have a precious little 2-year-old in our home right now, Nora. Now, life, you'd think life would be easy for a 2-year-old. Everybody wants to hold her. Everybody wants to hug her. Everybody wants to kiss her. Everybody wants to play with her. But I want to tell you, being 2 years old is not easy, because somebody's constantly saying, don't touch that. And she's still at the age where she stumbles some. She's a toddler. How would you like to have people 3 times taller than you always telling you, don't do that? And it's out of love, I understand that. But still, being a 2-year-old is not easy. Infants, when they come into the world, they don't come in the world laughing. Do they? I've been present when a lot of them were born. They come in the world crying. That's life on this earth. It's going to be that way. I'm not saying that life isn't good and God isn't good. It is. But in the midst of all the goodness and the blessings, there are going to be those seasons in life. Last night we went out to celebrate a birthday, and one of the little boys, sweet little boy, stumped his toe. Did a lot of damage to it, bleeding. At the restaurant. It looked like it needed stitches. That's life. That's what's going to happen to us down here, right? Y'all say, Brother Sam, I didn't come this morning to hear all this. What I'm saying is this. Everybody you know is going to have problems. Now, you can look across the aisle and think, man, I wish my life was like theirs. Well, if you was over there with them a little while, you'd probably say, I want to go back to where I was. Life is that way, right? Are y'all getting this? Am I wasting my time up here this morning? See, our attitude is so important. Another inspirational woman to me, was crippled in a diving accident when she was a young teenage girl, and she's been in a wheelchair ever since. Johnny Erickson, paralyzed from her neck down. Have you all ever seen her? She wanted to die. Somebody had to change her diaper. They had to feed her. But I tell you what, she began to grow in her faith, and she's become one of the greatest testimonies in the history of the human race. Incredible. She learned how to paint with a paintbrush in her teeth. And she can paint beautiful pictures with her teeth. And she travels the world in a wheelchair, inspiring handicapped people, disabled people. And you know what her statement is? She said, "Let gratitude be your attitude." Amen. Wow. Now that's not Brother Sam telling y'all. That's a real person with a real handicap that's enjoying life. See, your attitude determines your altitude. It does. And your attitude is something you have a lot of control over. Do y'all believe that? You say, "I just can't help what I think." Yes, you can. You start reading this good book and other good books, and you start singing. Have you ever noticed in these hymn books how many problems these people had? All these struggles. That's one reason we love the old hymns. It really identifies with our struggles and our trials. But you start listening, and they don't conclude on some sour note. They conclude on a note of faith in God. We love this hymn book. So you need to be listening to the right kind of music. You need to be reading the right kind of books. You need to be watching the right kind of shows if you're going to watch them. We watched one last night that was inspirational, wasn't it? Called The Little Boy. I don't know if y'all ever saw that or not. Made in 2015. It's a beautiful story of faith. Listen, hang around people that are uplifting. If you're around somebody that's always negative, everything's bad and it's going to get worse, I want to tell you, you need to choose other friends. Because most of the time you can't pick those people up, but they'll pull you down. So may God help us today. You see, faith in God is positive. It has to be. How can faith in God be negative? It can't be. You see, our faith is not in us. Our faith is not in the government. Our faith is not in some politician. Our faith is in the living God who created the heaven and the earth. And He loves us with an everlasting love and gave His Son to die for us on the cross and said, "I'm coming back." Said, "Don't let your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions." He says that to His brethren up there in the upper room. The night before He's going to die on the cross, He meets with them in the upper room and institutes His own memorial service, which would remind us of His broken body and His shed blood and His death. And then He washes the saints' feet. And then He says to them, He says, "Don't let your heart be troubled." See, one of the disciples is going to deny Him. One of them is going to betray Him. And He's going away. That's a lot of bad news to hit a little church in one night. Would you agree? He said to them at the table, "One of you is going to deny me. One of you is going to betray me. And I'm going away, and you can't go with me." But then notice what He said. Before they leave the upper room, He said, "Don't let your heart be troubled." What do you mean, Jesus? You just gave us the worst news a church could ever have, and now you're telling us, don't be troubled. Notice what He says. Don't let your heart be troubled. Why? Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house. Not in this world, but in my Father's house, that's heaven, are many mansions. And if it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again. I love that, don't you? What is the bride waiting for today? The coming of Jesus Christ. Someday, beloved, the heavens will part and the trumpet will sound. And the dead in Christ will rise first. And then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. So shall we ever be with the Lord. Wherefore comfort one another with these words. I never conduct a funeral but what I quote that verse at the graveside. Yes, we've just planted your loved one in the earth, and we have to say goodbye, and death is final to us. But let me tell you, it's not final to God. Someday, this individual will live again in the morning of the resurrection. And that body is going to be raised and glorified and taken to the Father's house. And Jesus said, don't let your heart be troubled. Everything down here is temporal. It's transitory. Talk about wildernesses. Folks, I'm going to tell you, old age is pretty rough. And I'm right on the edge of it. I really am. I tell you, this trip to Las Vegas got me. I flew out there. You know, it's 2 time zones between here and there. And before my body ever halfway got used to it, I was coming back east. My body didn't know if I was going west or east. And when I got home, let me tell you, I crashed. I could have done that when I was 30 years old. It would have been a breeze. There's some elderly people in this church can tell you that old age is tough. It's not for wimps. But here's the wonderful thing about it. God has said, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. My grace is sufficient for you. I can get you through anything and everything down here. And someday I'm coming back to get you and take you home to glory. And that is the ultimate hope, isn't it? See, God's children have got to always keep their faith on God in heaven, not on this crazy world. I tell you, this world is a mess, and I'm afraid it's going to get worse. What happened in Nice, France, wasn't that horrible? Absolutely horrible. What happened in Dallas a few weeks ago, what happened in Turkey, I'm glad God is God, aren't y'all? I'm glad God is sovereign. I'm glad His purposes will not fail. And though He suffers man to make a lot of mistakes down here, He says to draw near to me and I'll draw near to you. May God help us is my prayer for Jesus' sake today. Let's sing a hymn. Do you have a selection? Yes. What number is that?
582.
Number 582. Let's stand together as we sing this selection. And if you're here today and looking for a church home, we encourage you to come and join with us today. Number 582. Brother Joshua, would you